President Trump was warned over and over again that his administration wasn't ready for a pandemic. Now, thousands have died and millions have lost their jobs. But to really understand the extent of the crisis, you have to see these eerily accurate warnings that Trump and his senior team were getting for years. We're going to start in January 2017, about 2 months after President Trump is elected, and the Defense Department puts out this pandemic response report, which notes that the most likely and significant threat is a novel respiratory disease like the coronavirus, and warns of a shortage of ventilators, face masks, and hospital beds. Then, a week before Trump is inaugurated, Obama officials walked Trump's senior security officials through a pandemic response exercise where they showed them slides like this one, warning of impending shortages of key resources, including personal protective equipment and things like ventilators. 2 months later, Elizabeth Warren, Patty Murray, and other congressional Democrats send this letter to the head of the CDC and the Health and Human Services Secretary, warning that President Trump is already threatening at least 7 programs that focus on pandemic flu preparedness. In April 2017, the Washington Post reports that the Trump administration is ill-prepared for a global pandemic. It's filled few of the senior positions critical to responding to an outbreak, and it's proposed sharp cuts to government agencies working to stop deadly outbreaks at their source. This guy was appointed by President Obama to lead the global pandemic response at the National Security Council. Now, his team is disbanded by President Trump in 2018, but in October 2017, he is writing a blog post for the Trump White House website, noting that the world remains underprepared to prevent, detect, and respond to infectious disease outbreaks. Months later, the U.S. intelligence community puts out its worldwide threat assessment, which warns that a novel strain of a virulent microbe that's easily transmissible continues to be a major threat with the potential for a severe global health emergency and major economic and societal disruption. That same month, the CDC announces it is massively cutting pandemic prevention work in a bunch of countries, including China. A coalition of 200 global health organizations says that critical momentum will be lost if that funding is reduced, and the world will be unprepared for the next outbreak. A week later, Bill Gates says he has personally and repeatedly spoken to President Trump about pandemic preparedness and says that the U.S. government is falling short of preparing the nation and the world for a significant probability of a large and lethal modern-day pandemic. That fall, President Obama's former Homeland Security advisor writes this essay, warning that there are clear signs that the world is unprepared for the next outbreak, that funding is being significantly cut back, and that the failure to take this crisis seriously is potentially deadly. It's at this point that the White House fires Tim Ziemer and disbands the Global Pandemic Response Team. Even at the time, former U.S. officials call it a really concerning rollback of progress on health security preparedness. And remarkably, one of the members of the team that's disbanded, the day before it happens, is speaking at a 100th anniversary of the 1918 flu pandemic. And she says, a threat of a pandemic flu is the number one health security concern. Are we ready to respond? I fear the answer is no. In January 2019, the U.S. intel community puts out another worldwide threat assessment, warning that the U.S. remains vulnerable to a large-scale outbreak of a contagious disease that could lead to massive rates of death and disability and severely affect the world economy. At this point, we're under a year away from the coronavirus outbreak. The Trump administration is getting repeated warnings. What is it doing to respond? Well, in July, the CDC eliminates a key public health position in Beijing intended to help detect disease outbreaks in China. And then in October, the U.S. cuts off funding for PREDICT, which is a program to identify animal viruses that might infect humans and head off new pandemics. Also in October 2019, the Department of Health and Human Services put out this document marked Do Not Distribute. It was the result of a months-long pandemic response simulation that found that the U.S. wasn't ready for a pandemic like the coronavirus. Among other things, they identified that the U.S. didn't have the means to quickly manufacture essential medical equipment like N95 masks, antiviral medications, and ventilators. That same report accurately predicted that confusion would emerge as state governments turned to the federal government to address these shortages. So now President Trump has received 3 years of warnings, and on January 3rd, 2020, the U.S. gets the first formal notification of the outbreak in China. But it's clear that President Trump isn't taking this seriously. Even as U.S. intelligence agencies are issuing ominous classified warnings in January about the global danger posed by the coronavirus, Trump's health secretary can't seem to get through to speak to him. When he does finally reach him on January 18th, Trump interjected to ask about vaping and flavored vaping products. He then, that same day, goes golfing, and over the course of the next 2 months, from mid-January to mid-March, he golfs 6 times at his resorts and holds 8 campaign rallies. On January 20th, the U.S. confirms its first case of coronavirus, but 2 days later, the president still seems unconcerned.
Are there worries about a pandemic at this point?
No, we're not at all, and we have it totally under control.
Within a week, one of Trump's most trusted advisors puts out this major memo. It warns that the coronavirus crisis could cost the United States trillions of dollars and put millions of Americans' lives at risk. It also makes the point that the coronavirus is more contagious and deadlier than the seasonal flu. Despite that, President Trump will spend 2 more months comparing COVID-19 to the common flu. On January 26th, the Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer calls on the feds to declare a public health emergency. 1 day after that, Joe Biden says that Trump isn't doing enough to deal with the crisis. And 1 day after that, Elizabeth Warren releases a plan to address the coronavirus's impact on the economy. This is still late January. Already, South Korea, which got its first coronavirus case confirmed on the same day as the U.S., is testing 10,000 people a day, but the Trump administration isn't yet mobilizing. So on February 5th, when the Health and Human Services Secretary asked for $2 billion to buy respirator masks and other emergency medical equipment, he's denied, and the Trump administration only supplies about 25% of the requested funds. Meanwhile, on February 7th, the State Department announces that it is transporting 17.8 tons of medical supplies, including masks and respirators, to China. Trump spends February downplaying the outbreak. On February 24th, he's saying the coronavirus is very much under control in the USA. On February 25th, he says his administration is doing a great job. And that same day, when a CDC official issues a serious warning about the virus, Trump calls back to D.C. from an international flight to complain that the official is scaring the stock markets. By March, the coronavirus had spread around the country, and large portions of the economy had come to a halt. And President Trump changed his line. He started saying things like this on March 6th.
It's an unforeseen problem, not a problem. Came out of nowhere.
Or like this on March 11th.
We're having to fix a problem that 4 weeks ago nobody ever thought would be a problem. Nobody.
Or like this on March 26th.
Nobody would have ever thought a thing like this could have happened.
But as we've seen, he was warned, and the warnings fell on deaf ears. Budgets were cut and experts were eliminated. The U.S. moved too slowly, and it didn't have the testing or the supplies or the federal leadership that it needed. And the result has been the greatest wave of mass layoffs in American history, and an untold number of people being unnecessarily infected or losing their lives.
It's an unforeseen problem, not a problem.